The day the aliens spoke to Earth, it was a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Friday. Not a historic Sunday. A plain, boring Tuesday in October, when most people were drinking their morning coffee, dropping their kids off at school, or sitting in traffic complaining about the weather. The kind of Tuesday where nothing important was supposed to happen. But the universe did not check anyone's calendar. At exactly 7:14 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, every screen on Earth went dark. Every phone. Every television. Every computer monitor. Every billboard in Times Square. Every digital display in every airport, train station and shopping mall on the planet. All of it, gone black. Silent. Dead. For exactly 3 seconds, the entire digital world held its breath. Then the signal came. It did not come through satellites. It did not come through radio towers or fiber optic cables or any system that human engineers had ever built. It came from everywhere at once, pushed directly into every device simultaneously, as if the laws of physics had simply stepped aside and allowed it to happen. The image that appeared on every screen was not a face. It was not a flag or a symbol or a greeting card. It was a shape, a massive geometric construction floating in what looked like deep space, its surface covered in shifting patterns of light, like circuits running across the body of something enormous and alive. The shape was hard to describe because it did not hold still. It rotated slowly, its edges folding and unfolding in ways that made the human eye uncomfortable, like watching something that existed in more dimensions than the human brain was designed to process. And then the voice came. It did not speak in English. It did not speak in any human language. But every single person on Earth understood it perfectly, not through their ears but through something deeper. The words arrived fully formed inside the mind, clear and cold and absolutely certain of themselves. People of the third planet of the star you call the Sun. You have been evaluated. Your species has been judged. You are primitive. You are dangerous. You are unworthy of continued independence. You will cease all military activity immediately. You will dismantle all weapons of mass destruction within 30 of your planetary rotations. You will submit a formal declaration of surrender to the Galactic Authority within 60 of your planetary rotations. Failure to comply will result in the correction of your civilization. This is not a negotiation. This is an instruction. You have been informed. And then the screens went back to normal. The news was still playing. A commercial for a fast food restaurant ran on a television in a diner in Ohio. A teenage boy in California looked at his phone and saw that his app was working again. A truck driver in Texas blinked at his radio, which had just come back to life playing a country song about lost love. For about 4 seconds the world was completely silent. And then it absolutely lost its mind. In Washington, D.C., the President of the United States, a sharp-faced woman named President Carol Mercer, was already in the Situation Room before the signal had even finished playing. She had seen it on the screen in her private office and she had not panicked. She was not the kind of person who panicked, but she had set down her coffee very carefully, straightened her jacket, and walked with controlled urgency down the hall, because she understood immediately that the next few hours were going to define the rest of human history. The Situation Room was full of generals and advisors and intelligence chiefs, all of them talking at the same time. Satellite data was being pulled. Military bases around the world were being put on high alert. The phones were ringing non-stop, world leaders calling in from every time zone, their voices ranging from controlled professionalism to barely hidden terror. Everyone stopped talking, President Mercer said. She did not shout it. She said it in the same tone she used when she was ordering lunch. But something in her voice cut through the noise like a blade, and the room went quiet. First, she said, sitting down at the head of the table, we confirm that everyone received the same message. Then we find out who or what sent it. Then we decide how to respond. In that order. Let's go. General Frank Holt, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a massive man with a gray crew cut and 30 years of military service behind him, placed both hands flat on the table. Madam President, every nation on Earth received the same transmission simultaneously. We've already confirmed that with our NATO partners, with China, with Russia. Same message, same timing, down to the millisecond. The source. Unknown. The signal did not come from any point in our solar system. Our best analysis suggests it was transmitted from something located approximately 4 light-years away, near the Alpha Centauri system. But Madam President, he paused, and for the first time in his career, General Frank Holt looked genuinely uncertain. The signal traveled 4 light-years in less than a second. That's not supposed to be possible. Carol Mercer looked at him for a long moment. And yet here we are, she said. Get me the UN Secretary General. Get me the leaders of China, Russia, the EU, and every other major power. And get me Dr. Yara Solon from NASA. I want her in this room within the hour. Dr. Solon is already on her way, said her chief of staff, a young man named Daniel Park, whose voice was impressively steady for someone whose hands were visibly shaking. Good, said Mercer. Then let's get to work. Dr. Yara Solon was 44 years old, and she had spent most of her adult life being completely certain that humanity was not alone in the universe. She had published papers about it. She had given talks about it. She had been laughed at in certain academic circles for being, as one particularly unpleasant colleague had put it, too optimistic about the neighborhood. She was not feeling optimistic right now. She arrived at the White House in a black SUV that had been sent for her before she had even gotten out of bed, and she walked into the Situation Room still wearing her reading glasses and carrying a tablet loaded with everything she had managed to pull together in the last 40 minutes. She was not a tall woman, and she was not particularly intimidating to look at, brown skin, natural hair pulled back in a hurried bun, wearing a gray blazer over a NASA sweatshirt, but when she started talking, the room listened. The signal is real, she said before anyone asked her. I know there will be people arguing it's a hoax. It is not a hoax. The electromagnetic signatures we're detecting from the direction of Alpha Centauri are unlike anything in our records. Something out there generated enough energy in the last 12 hours to power our entire civilization for approximately 6,000 years. They wanted us to know they were there. They wanted us to know they could reach us. And they wanted us to understand that they are not impressed. They called us primitive, said General Holt. They called us primitive and dangerous, said Yara. Which is actually interesting. She pulled up something on her tablet and connected it to the room's main display. Most of the popular theories about first contact assumed that any species advanced enough to find us would either be friendly and curious, or completely indifferent. The idea that they would open with a surrender demand, that's new. That tells us something. What does it tell us? Asked President Mercer. Yara looked at her directly. It tells us they're afraid of us. The room was quiet for a moment. Excuse me, said General Holt. Think about it, said Yara. A civilization capable of transmitting signals across 4 light years in under a second, capable of generating the kind of energy we're detecting, they could have just come here and taken over. They could have sent a rock the size of a mountain into our planet at 90% of the speed of light and turned us into a footnote. They didn't. They sent a message first. A message that told us to dismantle our weapons and surrender. Why do that? Why bother? If you're truly, completely, utterly superior, you don't negotiate. You don't even warn. You just act. She set her tablet down. They warned us because they're not sure what we'd do if they didn't. They warned us because on some level we scare them. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Then President Mercer said very quietly, "Good." The world did not handle the news well, and no one had expected it to. In the first 24 hours, there were riots in 17 cities. Stock markets crashed to numbers that financial analysts described as beyond the scope of our models, which was a polite way of saying that the models had never imagined a scenario this bad. 3 governments collapsed, not because the aliens had done anything yet, but because their populations simply stopped believing in them. Churches and mosques and temples were full beyond capacity. Social media was a screaming hurricane of fear and conspiracy theories and religious interpretation, and people saying goodbye to their families as if the end was coming tomorrow. But alongside all of that, and this was something that the news cameras kept catching almost accidentally in the background of their disaster reports, people also kept doing what people do. A man in Chicago shoveled his neighbor's driveway because it had snowed overnight and she was elderly. A group of teenagers in Seoul organized a food drive for families who were too scared to leave their houses. A firefighter in Sao Paulo ran into a burning building to get a dog. A woman in Lagos sat with her arm around a stranger who was crying in the street, not saying anything, just being there. Humanity was terrified. Humanity was also, in a very quiet and stubborn way, still being human. On day 3 after the message, the United Nations held an emergency session. Every nation sent a representative, which had never happened before in the UN's history, not for wars, not for pandemics, not for climate summits. Every single country on Earth sent someone to the table. The session lasted 19 hours. There were arguments. There were accusations. There were moments when it looked like the whole thing was going to collapse into the same political chaos that had defined human international relations for centuries. A representative from one nation stood up and said that humanity should comply, that resistance was suicide, that the smart move was to surrender now and negotiate terms. Several other nations agreed with him. A representative from another nation stood up and said that humanity had never once in its entire history surrendered to a threat it hadn't first tried to fight, and it wasn't going to start now. A third representative, a quiet, older woman from a small country that most people couldn't find on a map, stood up last and said something that changed the tone of the entire conversation. "I have listened to both arguments," she said, "and I understand both. But I want to say something that I believe is more important than strategy. We were told to kneel. We were not asked. We were not invited. We were not approached with respect or curiosity or even basic acknowledgement of our humanity. We were told, like children being corrected, like animals being domesticated, like a problem being managed, we were told to kneel." She paused. "I do not think the question before us is whether we can win a war against a civilization 4 light years away. I think the question is whether we are the kind of species that kneels when ordered to. And I believe that answer was decided a long time before today." The chamber was very quiet when she finished. Then one by one the representatives began to applaud. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. The resolution passed. Earth will not comply. What happened next, what humanity decided to do about it, was the beginning of everything. Because humanity did not simply decide to fight. Humanity decided to build. The plan that came out of the next 30 days of emergency global cooperation was unlike anything the species had ever attempted. It was born out of panic and determination and the kind of creative desperation that humans had always been surprisingly good at. It drew on every nation's military technology, every physicist's understanding of propulsion and energy, every engineer's knowledge of materials and construction. It was called, in the formal documentation, the Global Defense Initiative. But the people who built it, the engineers and soldiers and scientists who would spend the next 3 years pouring everything they had into its construction, called it something else. They called it the Black Armada. And the universe had no idea what was coming. His name was Commander James Rowe, and he was the wrong man for the job, which, as it turned out, made him exactly the right man for the job. He was 47 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had been through a significant amount of weather. He had spent 22 years in the United States Navy, commanded 2 aircraft carriers, and had been described by his superiors in their evaluation reports as brilliant, infuriating, and correct more often than is comfortable. He had also been described by a general who did not like him as the kind of man who would argue with God about the design of gravity. He had been retired for 8 months when the message came. He was living in a small house on the coast of Oregon, doing woodworking and reading books about naval history and generally trying to convince himself that a quiet life was something he could sustain. He was not succeeding at this project. The call came at 4 a.m., 3 days after the alien transmission. It was General Holt's personal line, which meant it was not the kind of call you ignored. "Rowe," said Holt's voice without preamble, "I need you in Washington by noon." "I'm retired," said Rowe. "I know. Come anyway." Rowe arrived at the Pentagon at 11:47 a.m., still wearing the flannel shirt he'd been chopping wood in that morning. He was given a badge, taken through 3 separate security checkpoints, and walked into a conference room where 15 of the most important military and scientific minds on the planet were sitting around a table covered in holographic displays and classified documents. Dr. Yara Solon was there. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had not slept in 3 days and was surviving on coffee and determination. General Holt stood up. "Commander Rowe, thank you for coming. Sit down." "What's this about, Frank?" said Rowe, using the general's first name in a way that made 2 of the other generals visibly wince. "We're building a fleet," said Holt. "The biggest thing humanity has ever constructed. Ships capable of reaching and engaging whatever is out there. We need someone to design the combat doctrine, oversee the tactical framework, and eventually command the operation." He paused. "We want you." Rowe looked at him. "You want me to build a fleet to fight an alien civilization that can send signals across 4 light years in under a second?" "Yes." "A civilization that has technology so advanced that our best scientists can't even figure out what kind of physics they're using?" "Yes." "Using human technology that, by comparison, probably looks like we're throwing rocks." "That's why we need someone creative," said Holt. Rowe sat down. He looked at the holographic displays for a long moment. He looked at Yara Solon. "What do we actually know about them?" he asked her. Yara pulled up her analysis on the room's main screen. "We've been monitoring the Alpha Centauri system intensively since the message. We know there's a structure out there, massive, possibly artificial, possibly a station or a ship or something we don't have a word for yet. We know they have faster-than-light communication. We do not know if they have faster-than-light travel. We know they can project energy across interstellar distances. We do not know the upper limit of that capability. We know they find us threatening enough to warn before acting. We do not know why. We have 60 days before their deadline, said Ro. Technically 57 now, said Yara. And we can't build a fleet in 57 days. No, said Holt. We've asked for more time. Ro looked at him sharply. You sent them a message? We tried to. We broadcast on every frequency we have toward Alpha Centauri. No response yet. We don't know if they received it. Ro was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what resources do we have? And that was the moment everyone in the room understood that he was in. What James Ro discovered over the next 72 hours of briefings completely rewired his understanding of what was possible. Because humanity, this species that the aliens had called primitive, had been doing things in secret for a very long time. The public knew about the International Space Station. The public knew about the Mars missions and the lunar bases that had been established over the last decade. The public knew about commercial rockets and space tourism and the slow, grinding progress of interplanetary exploration. The public did not know about Project Nightshade. Project Nightshade had been running for 11 years, funded by a classified joint agreement between the United States, China, Russia, the European Union, and 6 other nations. It had been born out of a simple, uncomfortable question that certain very smart people in certain very high places had been asking for decades. What do we do if something out there finds us first? The answer they had built was not ready. It was not finished. But it was further along than anyone outside the project had imagined. There were 3 prototype warships in a classified construction facility on the far side of the moon, each one half a kilometer long, each one powered by a fusion reactor design that had taken 8 years to perfect, each one armed with weapon systems that had never been tested in actual combat because there had never been anything to test them against. There were propulsion systems capable of reaching 30% of the speed of light, which meant Alpha Centauri in roughly 13 years. Not fast enough to intercept an invasion, but fast enough to carry a fight to the enemy. There were materials. There were manufacturing capabilities. There were 10,000 engineers and scientists and military specialists already read into the program, already working, already building. James Ro stood in front of all of this data and felt something that very few people ever feel in their lifetime. He felt the exact weight of a moment in history, the precise sensation of standing at the hinge point between everything that had come before and everything that would come after. He did not feel inspired exactly. He felt something harder and colder and more focused than inspiration. He felt ready. Here's what we're going to do, he said, and he started talking, and he did not stop for 4 hours, and when he was done, the room full of the most experienced military and scientific minds on the planet was completely silent. Then Dr. Yara Solon said, "That's either the most brilliant plan I've ever heard or absolute insanity." "Why can't it be both?" said Ro. She thought about it. Fair point. The plan had 3 pillars. The first pillar was the Armada itself. Not 3 ships, 300. Ro had looked at the construction capacity of every participating nation and calculated that, with full global industrial mobilization, with every shipyard and factory and research facility on Earth and in Earth orbit redirected toward this single purpose, it was possible to have a fleet of 300 warships operational within 3 years. Not 57 days. 3 years. Which meant they needed to buy time. The second pillar was deception. They would respond to the Galactic Authority, not with surrender, not with defiance, but with the most elaborate diplomatic performance in human history. They would appear to comply. They would ask questions, request clarifications, raise procedural concerns, negotiate the terms of their surrender with such meticulous and exhausting detail that the clock would stretch. They would appear to be a confused, frightened, primitive species struggling to understand the requirements being placed on them. They would appear cooperative. They would appear small. While they built. The third pillar was the part that Ro himself considered the most important, and the most human. He called it the asymmetry doctrine. "We cannot beat them in a straight fight," he told the room. "Their technology is beyond ours. Their energy output is beyond ours. Their reach is beyond ours. If we try to fight them the way they expect us to fight, the way any reasonable civilization would fight, we lose." He paused. "So we don't fight them the way they expect. We fight them the way humans have always fought enemies that were bigger and stronger and better equipped. We fight dirty. We fight clever. We fight like something that has absolutely nothing to lose and everything to prove." He looked around the room. "We make them regret ever sending that message." The woman who would become Ro's most important partner in building the Black Armada was not a soldier. She was a shipbuilder. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she was 51 years old, and she had been building things since she was 6 years old, starting with Lego sets and graduating through increasingly ambitious constructions until she had, at age 32, become the lead architect of the world's largest commercial shipyard in Busan, South Korea. When the call came from the Global Defense Initiative, she was overseeing the construction of a deep space mining vessel the size of a football stadium. She took the call in her side office, surrounded by blueprints and empty coffee cups and a small framed photo of her daughter, who was 12 years old and wanted to be an astronaut. The man on the phone explained what they were asking her to do. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to know one thing." "What's that?" said the man on the phone. "Are these ships supposed to come back or just supposed to win?" There was a pause. "Ideally both." "Good," said Elena. "Because I design things to last." She was in Washington within 18 hours. Elena Vasquez and James Rowe met for the first time in a conference room in the Pentagon, and they did not like each other for approximately 45 minutes, which was about average for two extremely confident people who were used to being the smartest person in the room. Rowe wanted ships that were fast and maneuverable and built for asymmetric warfare, lean, aggressive, designed to hit and move and hit again. Elena wanted ships that were survivable, heavily armored, redundantly powered, capable of sustaining massive damage and continuing to function. They argued about it for 3 hours. They drew diagrams on whiteboards. They cited engineering principles at each other. They both went through 2 cups of coffee and showed no signs of stopping. Dr. Yara Solin, who had been watching from the corner of the room, finally stood up and said, "You're both right." They both looked at her. "You need ships that are fast and survivable," she said. "You need ships that can take a hit and keep moving. And you need ships that can do something neither of you has mentioned yet, ships that can surprise them." She pulled up a file on the room's display. "I've been analyzing the alien signal. There's something in the frequency pattern that our quantum physics team found yesterday. They believe, and I want to stress this is very early analysis, that the alien technology may operate on a fundamentally different principle than ours. It's not better versions of our physics. It's a different branch. Which means, they don't know what our physics can do," said Rose slowly. "Correct. Their models of us are based on their models of physics. But if we've developed certain capabilities that their framework wouldn't predict," she smiled for the first time in days, "we have surprises they can't anticipate." Rowe and Elena looked at each other. "How do you feel about building something that's never been built before?" Rowe asked her. Elena Vasquez had the expression of someone who had been waiting for this exact question her entire life. "Commander," she said, "that is literally the only kind of building I know how to do." The global mobilization that followed was the largest coordinated human effort in history. It dwarfed the Manhattan Project. It dwarfed the Apollo program. It dwarfed every wartime industrial surge that had come before it, and humanity had a long, extensive history of wartime industrial surges to compare it to. Shipyards on Earth were converted. New facilities were built in Earth orbit. The lunar manufacturing complex that had been established for mining operations was expanded and repurposed. Thousands of engineers were recruited, briefed, and set to work. Materials were redirected from commercial supply chains. National budgets were rewritten overnight. The world's population watched all of this happening and understood at some level what it meant. The news covered the construction in broad strokes, global defense preparations, they called it. The full scope of the Armada was classified, but you cannot build 300 warships without people noticing that something large and serious is happening. And the world, frightened, uncertain, grieving for the normal life it had lost, got behind it. Not because people weren't scared. They were terrified. But fear for humans has never been a stopping point. Fear for humans has always been a starting point. In cities around the world, people who had nothing to do with shipbuilding or weapons systems or military strategy found ways to contribute. Scientists in fields that seemed completely unrelated to warfare suddenly found their work being urgently recruited. Biologists, chemists, mathematicians, psychologists. Artists made propaganda posters that went viral. Teachers redesigned curricula to include aerospace engineering for children. A 12-year-old girl in Tokyo designed a propulsion modification in a school project that her teacher sent to NASA as a joke and that NASA's engineers actually used. Humanity, it turned out, was very good at this. It had been practicing for thousands of years. The diplomatic team that humanity sent to negotiate surrender with the Galactic Authority was handpicked by a woman named Ambassador Patricia Cole, who had spent 30 years as a professional negotiator and was widely regarded as the most patient human being alive. She was 63 years old, small and precise in her movements, with silver hair cut close and eyes that looked like they were always calculating 3 moves ahead. She had negotiated peace agreements, trade deals, hostage releases, and at one memorable point, a 47-hour conversation with a man holding a bomb in a Paris hotel that had ended with everyone alive and the man sitting quietly in a chair, having talked himself out of his own crisis. She had once been asked by a journalist what her secret was. "I never make the other person feel like they're losing," she had said. "Even when they are." She assembled a team of 12, linguists, scientists, military analysts, psychologists, and a specialist in xenobiology who technically had never studied actual aliens before but was very good at thinking about systems and behaviors she had never encountered. They were given a cover story, a strategy, and a set of instructions that boiled down to, buy us 3 years. The communication system they used to reach the Galactic Authority had been built by a team of physicists who had spent 6 weeks reverse engineering the alien transmission and figuring out how to send a signal in the same format. Whether the aliens would actually receive it was uncertain. Whether they would respond was even less certain. But on day 42, 18 days before the original deadline, a response came. It did not come through every screen on Earth this time. It came as a targeted signal, directed specifically at the transmission source, which meant the aliens had received humanity's message and had located its origin point. It also meant they were now in direct communication. The response was not warm. But it was a response. Your request for clarification has been received. You are granted an extension of 100 planetary rotations to fulfill the requirements of your surrender. Further extensions will not be granted. Begin compliance immediately. Patricia Cole read the message 3 times. Then she said to her team, 100 days. We asked for a year. They gave us 100 days. So we ask for clarification again, said Dr. Marcus Webb, her lead linguistic specialist, a thin, nervous man who had not left his desk in 4 days and whose understanding of the alien communication patterns was already more sophisticated than anyone else on Earth. We ask for clarification, Cole agreed. And we make the clarification request as complicated as possible. Over the next 3 weeks, they sent 17 separate messages to the Galactic Authority, each one containing detailed, procedural, and technically complex questions about the terms of surrender. What exactly constituted a weapon of mass destruction? How was military activity defined? What was the process for verifying compliance? Who, specifically, in the Galactic Authority had the authority to receive the surrender document? What was the proper format? What language should it be in? To anyone observing from outside, it looked like a confused, frightened civilization desperately trying to understand a situation beyond its comprehension. In reality, it was humanity at its most ruthlessly strategic, using the one weapon that no amount of superior technology could overcome: the ability to make paperwork so complicated that even the most powerful bureaucracy in the galaxy needed time to sort through it. The Galactic Authority responded to each message. Sometimes quickly, sometimes after days of silence. But they responded. And every response bought more time. Meanwhile, on the far side of the moon, the Black Armada grew. The name Black Armada came from the color of the ships. Elena Vasquez had made a decision early in the design process that the hulls of the warships would be coated in a material developed by a materials science team at MIT, a substance so dark it absorbed 99.9% of light, making the ships nearly invisible against the blackness of space. The material had originally been developed for telescope shielding. Elena had looked at its properties and immediately understood what it could do for a warship that did not want to be seen coming. She had presented the idea to Roe, who had responded with a single word: perfect. The ships were long and low profile, built for minimal visible cross-section, their surfaces smooth and unbroken by the protruding weapon systems that characterized most science fiction depictions of spacecraft. Everything that could fire, launch, or transmit was recessed into the hull, deployable in seconds but invisible at rest. They were, Elena liked to say, the physical embodiment of the old saying about quiet people. The ones you need to worry about are the ones who don't advertise. Each ship in the Black Armada was designated by a number and a name. The flagship, the largest ship, half a kilometer longer than any other vessel in the fleet, was designated BS-001. Roe named it the Defiance. Because of course he did. Dr. Yara Solon spent the 3 years of construction doing 2 things simultaneously: advising the weapons and propulsion teams, and studying the Galactic Authority with every instrument available to human science. What she found was complicated. The Galactic Authority, she determined, was not a single species. It was a coalition, possibly dozens of species, united under a shared political and cultural framework. The single structure near Alpha Centauri appeared to be an outpost or a monitoring station, not their home. Their home, or their center of power, was further away, in a direction that human astronomers had been staring at for years without knowing what they were looking at. She also found something that she brought to Ro privately, late one night in the construction facility on the lunar surface, while both of them were eating sandwiches in a break room and trying to remember what sleep felt like. "I think I know why they're afraid of us," she said. Ro looked at her. "Tell me." She pulled up a display on her tablet. "The Galactic Authority has been around for a long time. We're talking thousands of years of documented expansion and contact with other species. In every single case in the record patterns I've been able to decode, when they contacted a new species, that species either voluntarily joined the Authority within a few generations or the species was corrected." She paused. "In the communications we've received, they've used that word 3 times. Corrected. I've been trying to understand what it means in context. I think it means eliminated. They've killed civilizations before," said Ro. "Many of them. The ones that didn't comply. The ones they considered too dangerous." She set the tablet down. "But here's what I found that I think is the key to everything. In none of those cases, not one, did the species being corrected fight back in a way that the Authority hadn't predicted. In every case, the species being corrected either tried conventional warfare and was crushed, or they tried diplomacy and were ignored, or they simply gave up." She looked at him. "The Galactic Authority has never encountered a species that did what humans do." "What do we do?" said Ro. "We adapt. We improvise. We find solutions that shouldn't work and make them work anyway. We lose catastrophically and then come back angrier." She shook her head slowly. "James, I've been going through our history from the perspective of an outside observer. You want to know what it looks like? It looks insane. We've been hit by ice ages, pandemics, wars, famines, every kind of catastrophe you can name, and every single time we found a way through. Not because we were the strongest or the smartest or the best equipped. Because we are absolutely, stubbornly, impossibly difficult to stop." She paused. "I think the Galactic Authority has been trying to get a read on us since before they sent that first message. I think they've been watching us for decades, maybe longer. And I think what they saw scared them enough that they decided to move before we got any further." Ro was quiet for a while. "Too late," he said. Yara smiled. "Way too late." 2 years and 8 months into the construction program, Commander James Ro stood on the observation deck of the main lunar shipyard and looked at what humanity had built. It was not what he had planned exactly. Plans never survive contact with reality, and the construction of the Black Armada had encountered every kind of problem that was possible to encounter. Material shortages, design failures, engineering disagreements, political friction between nations, funding crises, 3 separate labor strikes, and one incident involving a reactor test that had destroyed an entire construction bay and set the program back 4 months. There had been moments when Ro had genuinely wondered if they were going to make it in time. But they had made it. Not 300 ships. 287. 13 had been lost or scrapped due to critical failures during construction. But 287 warships floated in formation in lunar orbit, dark as night against the stars, each one a product of the combined industrial and intellectual output of every nation on Earth. The Defiance sat at the front of the formation, and even from the observation deck, it was breathtaking, 680 meters long, its surface so dark it seemed to cut a hole in the sky. Ro stood there for a long time looking at what his species had done. Elena Vasquez came to stand beside him. She had spent the last 3 years living primarily on the lunar surface, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating when she remembered to, and building these ships with a ferocity that her team described as terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. She looked exhausted and satisfied in a way that only people who have built something truly extraordinary ever look. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," said Ro, "that the Galactic Authority is about to have the worst day of its existence." Elena looked at him. "You really think we can do this?" He turned to look at her, and his expression was not bravado. It was something quieter and more certain than bravado. "I think we're humans," he said. "We found a way to walk upright on 2 legs and then decided to walk on the moon. We built civilizations in deserts and jungles and Arctic tundra. We made music. We made art. We made mathematics and philosophy and medicine. We've been killing each other and healing each other and building and destroying and building again for 200,000 years." He looked back at the fleet. "These people out there looked at us and saw something primitive. They didn't look carefully enough. The crew of the Defiance was drawn from every nation on Earth. Ro had insisted on this. The Black Armada was not an American fleet or a Chinese fleet or a Russian fleet, it was a human fleet, and its crew would reflect that. 240 people served on the Defiance, speaking 43 languages between them, with a translation system built into every communication device that operated in real time. Row's first officer was a woman named Commander Sarah Chin, a former Chinese naval officer and aerospace engineer who had been one of the first people recruited into the GDI program 3 years earlier. She was 39 years old, precise and methodical, and possessed of a strategic mind that Row had compared, once in a private moment, to a chess grandmaster who also happened to be very good at hitting things. She did not entirely appreciate the comparison, but she did not disagree with it. Row's chief weapons officer was a man named Lieutenant Commander David Okafor, a Nigerian-British physicist who had helped design the primary weapon system used across the fleet, a directed energy weapon that operated on principles that the alien signal analysis suggested would be, in physics terms, entirely alien to the Galactic Authority's models. Yara Solan's team had spent 2 years figuring out how to weaponize quantum coherence effects at macro scale. David Okafor had spent 1 year turning that theory into something that could fit on a ship and point at a target. He was 29 years old, and he was the most dangerous person on the most dangerous ship in the most powerful fleet humanity had ever built. His chief reaction to this status was to drink slightly too much coffee and make dry jokes at stressful moments, which Row considered an entirely appropriate coping strategy. The chief navigator was a woman named Lieutenant Amara Diallo from Mali, who had grown up watching the stars through a telescope her grandfather had built from instructions he found in a library book. She was 27 years old and she knew the positions of every star within 50 light-years of Earth with a precision that made the navigation computers feel slightly redundant. The chief medical officer was Dr. Jonas Park, the younger brother of President Mercer's chief of staff, which was a coincidence that Row had not known about until the crew rosters were finalized and which he had decided was not relevant to anything. And there was one more member of the crew who occupied a role that had not been in any of the original planning documents. Her name was Dr. Lena Bright, and she was a psychologist. More specifically, she was a specialist in alien communication and behavioral analysis, the world's only one really because the world had not previously had aliens to analyze. She had been working with Patricia Cole's diplomatic team for 2 years, building the most sophisticated model of galactic authority psychology and decision-making that human science had ever produced. Row had added her to the crew over the objection of 3 different generals, on the grounds that understanding the enemy's mind was just as important as understanding the enemy's weapons. "They're not going to let us talk to them," one of the generals had pointed out. "They might," said Row. "And even if they don't, she'll be able to tell me how they think, which means I'll be able to tell you how they'll move. That's worth more than another weapons officer." He was right. He was annoyingly right about things with great regularity, which was one of the reasons people found him infuriating and also one of the reasons they kept listening to him. The communication from the Galactic Authority came on day 947 since the first message, 2 years, 7 months, and about 3 weeks after humanity had begun its delaying action. Ambassador Patricia Cole's team had kept the diplomatic channel alive this whole time, a masterwork of procedural obstruction and strategic confusion that had consumed enormous amounts of the authority's apparent patience. They had asked questions. They had raised concerns. They had submitted partial compliance documentation, then retracted it with corrections, then resubmitted it with amendments. They had done everything in their power to make the process of humanity's surrender so complicated and time-consuming that the authority had apparently decided it was less efficient to invade than to simply wait for the paperwork to finish. But on day 947, the authority's patience ran out. The message came through the diplomatic channel and it was short. "Your delaying tactics have been identified. They are noted. Regardless of your strategy, your species remains unaligned and non-compliant. You have been given more than sufficient time. You have failed to comply. The correction process will begin in 30 of your planetary rotations. There is nothing further to discuss." Patricia Cole read the message, set it down, and called Row. "They figured it out," she said. "How much time?" said Row. 30 days. A long pause. "Is the fleet ready?" "Are you asking me or are you asking yourself?" "Both, I guess." Another pause. Then she said, "Commander, I've spent 3 years convincing these people that we were weak and confused and willing to eventually comply. I am asking you, on behalf of every human being alive, to make sure that none of that was a lie about who we actually are." Row looked at the defiance through the viewport of his office. "It wasn't a lie," he said. "It was camouflage." He ended the call. Then he opened the fleet-wide channel. "Attention Black Armada. This is Commander Row. The clock is running. We have 30 days. I want full combat readiness within 15. Move." The Black Armada left the solar system on day 22. Not because it had to, The Galactic Authority's deadline was 30 days, not 22, but because Ro had no intention of waiting for the enemy to come to him. The asymmetry doctrine was built on one foundational principle. Never fight the battle your enemy prepared for. Fight a different battle. Fight it where they don't expect it. Fight it in a way they didn't design their defenses to handle. The Authority expected, if they expected anything at all from humanity, that humanity would huddle near its home planet and wait to be corrected. The Black Armada was going to meet them halfway and tell them, in terms that required no translation, that Earth was not the kind of place you corrected. The departure was not announced. There was no ceremony, no broadcast, no crowd watching from Earth's surface. The ships simply moved, 287 dark shapes sliding out of lunar orbit and accelerating faster and faster, until they were moving at a speed that felt almost impossible, 30% of the speed of light, the stars ahead of them beginning to shift subtly blue with the Doppler effect of their passage. In her seat at the navigation console of the Defiance, Lieutenant Amara Diallo watched the solar system fall away behind them and felt something she could not quite name. Not fear, not excitement, but something in between, something solemn and immense. She had grown up watching the stars. Now she was going to them. In his command chair, Ro was reading the latest intelligence from Yara Solon, who had stayed behind to coordinate the sensor network that humanity had deployed in the space between Earth and Alpha Centauri over the last 2 years. Hundreds of small dark sensor platforms, indistinguishable from debris, scattered across a quarter of a light-year of space. Not enough to stop anything but enough to see everything. What they were seeing was not reassuring. The structure near Alpha Centauri, which Solon's team had named the Nexus, because it appeared to be a hub of some kind, had been active over the last month in ways it hadn't been previously. Energy outputs had increased significantly. New shapes had appeared around it, smaller than the Nexus but large enough to be ships. Possibly a lot of ships. How many? Ro asked. Yara's voice came through the communication system, lagging slightly with distance even at light speed. Our best count is approximately 400 vessels. Possibly more. Some of our sensors in that region have gone dark, which either means they malfunctioned or the Authority found them and eliminated them. 400 versus 287, said Sarah Chin from the first officer's station. Those are the numbers we can see, said Ro. We don't know what else they have. He paused. Doesn't matter. We're not fighting them at those numbers. What are we doing? Said Chin. We're doing what humans have always done against bigger, better-equipped enemies, said Ro. He looked at the star field ahead of them. Alpha Centauri, still 4 light-years away, a bright star in the distance that now held an entirely different meaning than it had 3 years ago. We're being clever. The journey to Alpha Centauri took 13 years at 30% of light speed. Except that it did not, for the crew of the Black Armada, feel like 13 years. The ships carried enough supplies and recycling capacity for a crew that would age normally over that span, but the psychological weight of 13 years in the void between stars, with no planet to look at, no civilization to communicate with, just the crew and the ships in the dark, was something that Ro had spent considerable thought preparing for. He had talked to Dr. Lena Bright about it at length during the planning phase. What breaks people in long confinement, Lena had told him, is not the boredom. It's the loss of purpose. They forget why they're there. They lose the sense that what they're doing matters. She had paused. Your people need to know every single day that what they're doing matters. They need the mission to feel alive, not like a waiting room. Ro had taken that seriously. The Defiance, and all 287 ships in the fleet, became, over the course of the 13-year journey, something that had not been in the design specifications. They became communities. People fell in love. People had children. This had not been planned, but it happened because humans are human, and Ro had decided that trying to prevent it would be both futile and cruel. The children born on the ships were, technically, the first humans born in interstellar space. There were 43 of them by the time the fleet reached its destination, and they were the subject of some of the most earnest scientific documentation in human history, because everyone wanted to know if being born in space changed a person. It turned out it didn't. Not in any of the ways people expected. The children born on the Black Armada were curious and brave, and comfortable in the dark in a way that planet-born humans never quite were. They had grown up with the stars not as distant lights in a sky, but as a surrounding presence, close and immediate. They did not fear the void. They had never known anything else. Ro watched them grow up, and he thought about the Galactic Authority which had looked at Earth and seen something primitive. He wondered if they had a concept for this, for a species that could take what should have been a death sentence and turn it into a nursery. He doubted it. Not everything was peaceful. In Year 4 there was an incident on one of the fleet's mid-range ships, a vessel called the Iron Resolve, that nearly ended in mutiny. The captain of the Iron Resolve, a Polish naval officer named Commander Alexander Nowak, had been quietly losing his psychological stability for months. The isolation had worked on him in ways that the pre-departure evaluations had not caught. He had begun to believe, in the small airless hours of the night watch, that the mission was suicide, that they were not going to fight the Galactic Authority, but were going to be destroyed by them, and that the real reason the governments of Earth had built this fleet and sent it out here was not to win a war, but to sacrifice a generation of soldiers to buy time for the people back home. He was not entirely wrong about the last part, which was what made it complicated. He had shared these beliefs with his crew, and a significant portion of them had begun to agree with him, in the way that people agree with things in enclosed spaces when there's nothing else to think about. Rowe found out about it through the fleet's communications monitoring system and arrived on the Iron Resolve within 18 hours, transferred over via one of the small shuttle craft that the ships carried for just such intership travel. He went alone. He told Sarah Chin he was going alone, and she argued with him for 6 minutes and then stopped arguing because she knew it wouldn't work. He sat with Nowak in the captain's quarters of the Iron Resolve for 4 hours. Not briefing him. Not issuing orders. Just talking. Talking about the mission, about fear, about the difference between a sacrifice and a choice, about what they were going home to, the children and the cities and the ordinary life that every single person on every one of these ships had given up for 13 years in the dark. "You think we're being thrown away," Rowe said. Nowak looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Aren't we?" "If I thought that," said Rowe, "I would have said no when they asked me. I've said no before. I know what it looks like when politicians sacrifice soldiers to save themselves." He looked at Nowak steadily. "This isn't that. This is the whole world trying to survive something it didn't choose. And the only way it survives is if we do this. Not die doing this. Do this." He paused. "I need you to believe that we're going out there to win. 'Cause I believe it. I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Nowak was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How are you so sure?" Rowe thought about it. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But I'm human. And humans don't stop when they're not sure. They keep going anyway. It's maybe our most annoying quality." Nowak laughed. It was short and tired and not entirely happy, but it was a laugh. He stood his crew down. The Iron Resolve continued with the fleet. In year 8, Dr. Lena Bright made a discovery that changed everything. She had been working, throughout the journey, on a continuous analysis of every communication from the Galactic Authority, the messages sent before the fleet left, the communications relayed back to them through Yara Solan's sensor network, every fragment and piece of data she could access. She had been building a behavioral model that she could use to predict Authority decision-making, how they would respond to the fleet's appearance, what they were likely to do, what their doctrine was. And in year 8, she found something in the Authority's communication patterns that she had not expected. She brought it to Rowe on a quiet evening when he was in his quarters with the lights low, rereading a book about the Second World War because it was his habit when he needed to think, reading about other humans who had faced impossible situations and found their way through them. "I need to show you something," she said. He listened. What she had found was this. Within the Galactic Authority there was a faction. Not a small one. A significant portion of the Authority's internal communications, which she had been able to partially decode using patterns identified over years of analysis, suggested that there were members of the Authority who did not agree with the approach to Earth, who believed that humanity should have been approached differently, who had argued internally against the surrender demand. They had lost that argument, but they had not disappeared. "You're saying there are people inside the Authority who don't want this war," said Rowe. "I'm saying there are people inside the Authority who believe it was a mistake," said Lena. "Which is different but possibly more useful." She paused. "If there's a faction that thinks humanity was handled wrong, and if that faction is large enough to matter, then this doesn't have to be purely a military engagement." Rowe looked at her for a long moment. "You've been building this model for 8 years, he said. "Tell me, if we show up at the Nexus with 287 warships and we don't immediately start shooting, what happens?" Lena thought for a moment. "They'll be confused," she said. "Confused and alarmed. They'll expect us to either attack or demand terms. If we do neither," she thought again. "I don't know. No species has ever done that before. Come to them armed and then waited." She paused. "That uncertainty might be the most powerful weapon we have." "Caro," said Rowe quietly. It was a word he had picked up from one of the crew, a Ghanaian engineer named Kofi who used it the way others used, and so, or then. A word meaning something like "and from this point on things change." Ro had heard it dozens of times over the years and it had stuck in his mind. And so, from this point on. Caro, said Lena, understanding. What are you going to do? Something they've never seen before, said Ro. Something that will work either way, whether we have to fight or whether we find those people you're talking about. He paused. We're going to show them what we are. Not what they think we are. What we actually are. The Black Armada dropped out of maximum acceleration 3 months from Alpha Centauri, slowing to a speed that would allow the sensor systems to function properly and give the crew time to prepare. What they found on their sensors made the bridge of the Defiance go very quiet. The Nexus was larger than the longest-range analysis from Earth had suggested. It was not a station. It was a world, artificial, constructed, but world-scale in its mass and volume. A sphere 2,000 kilometers across, its surface covered in structures that caught the light of Alpha Centauri A and B in ways that suggested materials humanity had no equivalent for. Around it, in orderly formations, floated ships. Many ships. David Okafor ran the count 3 times and then looked up from his console. 712, he said in the tone of voice people use when they are trying very hard to sound calm. Sarah Chin caught Ro's eye. She said nothing. Ro looked at the display for a long moment. 712 ships against 287. The individual ships of the Authority fleet were larger than anything in the Black Armada. Their energy signatures were enormous. They were waiting for us, said Amara Diallo from navigation. Of course they were, said Ro. They figured out the delay tactic 3 years ago. They had time to prepare. He stood up from the command chair. This doesn't change the plan. The plan was designed for 400 ships, Chin said quietly. The plan was designed for what we could surprise. 712 can still be surprised. He looked around the bridge. We just have to be better at surprising them. He opened the fleet-wide channel. This is Commander Ro. What you're seeing on your sensors is accurate. There are more of them than we planned for. I want every captain in this fleet to understand what that means and what it doesn't mean. It means this is harder than we wanted it to be. It does not mean it is impossible. It does not mean we turn around. We are 2 months from our objective. We will use those 2 months to be ready for what we're about to do. He paused. I am proud of every single person in this fleet. You left your home, your families, everything you knew. You traveled 13 years in the dark. You are here and you are ready, and you are about to do something that will be remembered as long as humanity exists. I need you present. I need you focused. I need you to be exactly what you are, human beings who were told to kneel. He paused again. Let's remind them why that was a mistake. He closed the channel. Then he turned to Dr. Lena Bright, who was standing at the back of the bridge watching. How close are we to the faction? He asked. She had been running updated analysis since they entered the system. I've identified a communication pattern that I believe comes from the dissident group, the ones who opposed the Earth approach. I think I can use our communication system to send a message that will reach them specifically, encoded in a way the main authority signals won't recognize. Do it, said Ro. Send them our message. She paused. What message? He thought for a moment. Tell them, we are not here to destroy. We are here to be seen. We would prefer to talk to those who see us clearly. Lena looked at him. Then she went to work. 2 months out from the Nexus, the Black Armada received its first communication from the Galactic Authority since leaving the solar system. It came through the same channel as the original surrender demand, broadcast, universal, meant to be heard by everyone. Humans, you have departed your system and are approaching the administrative nexus. This is a prohibited action under Galactic Authority protocol. You will stop immediately and submit to inspection and compliance verification. Failure to stop will be interpreted as a hostile act and will result in a defensive response. You have been warned. Ro let the message play through the fleet-wide channel so every crew member heard it. Then he activated the response system. This is Commander James Ro of the Earth vessel Defiance, speaking on behalf of the Black Armada and the people of Earth. We have received your message. We are not stopping. We are not submitting. We are not complying. He paused. We did not come all this way to stand still. We came to have a conversation your leadership apparently did not want to have on terms that were fair to both parties. We are coming to have that conversation now, in person, in a location where you cannot simply cut the transmission when it becomes inconvenient. Another pause. We are coming in peace if peace is possible. We are coming in war if war is what you prefer. The choice is yours. We will be there in 60 days. He closed the channel. Sarah Chin looked at him. That's either the most confident thing I've ever heard or the most reckless. Both, said Ro. Definitely both. Her name, when translated through the systems that Lena Bright and Marcus Webb had built together over years of work, was something that sounded approximately like Vishari, though this was an approximation of a name that existed in a form of communication that was as much light pattern as it was sound. She was a member of the Galactic Authority's Administrative Council. She was, by the standards of her species, a tall, vaguely cephalopod-in-shape people called the Veth, considered old, which meant she had lived through more than 200 of Earth's years. She had voted against the initial contact protocol for Earth. She had argued for 20 of those years that humanity was a special case, a young civilization with an unusual development pattern that deserved careful observation rather than immediate classification. She had been overruled. She had been marginalized. She had been politely and thoroughly ignored by the authorities' dominant faction, which operated on a very simple principle. New civilizations were either useful or dangerous, and useful ones were absorbed while dangerous ones were corrected. They had classified humanity as dangerous 11 years ago. She had argued then and continued arguing that dangerous was not the right word. The right word, she had said, was alive. They had not understood what she meant. Which was, she had thought privately, exactly her point. When the Black Armada's message arrived, encoded in the specific pattern that Lena Bright had designed and that Vishari had been listening for since humanity's signal analysis had first appeared in the authorities' intelligence reports, 8 years ago, she sat with it for a long time in her private quarters in the Nexus. We are not here to destroy. We are here to be seen. We would prefer to talk to those who see us clearly. She read it 3 times. Then she did something that, under the current authority protocols, was technically a violation of administrative law. She responded. The response came 12 days before the fleet reached the Nexus, and it arrived on the specific frequency Lena had designated for the dissident channel. Lena brought it to Ro at 2 in the morning ship time, when the bridge was running on skeleton crew and the lights were low. They answered, she said. He sat up. Read it to me. She read, You have been seen. You have been seen for a long time by some of us who recognized what you are. I cannot guarantee what will happen when you arrive. I cannot promise the Council will listen. But I can tell you that there are voices here who will argue for you, if you give them the opportunity. Do not fire first. Whatever happens, do not fire first. There are those here who want what you want. Give them a moment to speak. Ro was silent. It could be a trap, said Lena. A fake message from the main authority, designed to make us hesitate. Could be, said Ro. But the encoding she used matches patterns I've only seen in the dissident communications. If the main authority could crack that code, they'd have done it years ago. He thought for a moment. What does your model say? Is this real? Lena considered. The behavioral patterns in the message are consistent with a genuine dissident voice. The hesitation in the phrasing, the way she frames, some of us versus we, it matches what I've been watching for years. She paused. I think it's real. So do I, said Ro. He lay back down on his bunk. Don't fire first, he said softly. We can do that. 12 days later, the Black Armada arrived at the Nexus. It was an extraordinary sight, even after weeks of sensor data and preparation. Actually being there, seeing it with real eyes through the Defiance's forward viewports, was something that hit every person on the bridge like a physical force. The Nexus hung in space before them, vast and glittering, surrounded by its fleet of 700 ships. Alpha Centauri A blazed behind it, orange gold and enormous, painting everything in a light that was subtly different from Earth's sun. Warmer, older, heavier somehow. Amara Diallo, who had spent her life watching stars from the ground, looked at it and felt tears running down her face without entirely meaning them to. She was embarrassed for about a second and then she wasn't, because everyone on the bridge was feeling some version of the same thing. They were here. They had actually come here. All stop, said Ro. Hold formation. The Black Armada came to a stop approximately 50,000 kilometers from the outer edge of the Authority fleet. Not within engagement range. Not outside communication range. A deliberate, chosen distance that said, we see you, we're not running and we're waiting. The Authority fleet did not move. For 3 minutes nothing happened. Then Sarah Chin said, they're powering weapons. I see it, said Ro. 712 ships powering weapons, she said, and her voice was steady, which Ro later reflected was one of the bravest things he had ever witnessed. Hold, said Ro. We hold. Sir. We hold, he said again, quiet and certain. Not because we have to. Because we choose to. Another minute passed. And then, from a single ship in the Authority fleet, a ship that was smaller than most of the others, positioned at the outer edge of the formation, a communication came through. It was not through the standard broadcast channel. It was through the dissident frequency. You are being watched. The council is divided. You have 30 minutes before the faction that wants to fire overrules the faction that is asking for a vote. I suggest you use this time wisely. Speak. Make them hear you. Make them understand what we could not make them understand in 20 years of argument. Rose stood up from the command chair. Open all channels, he said. Everything. Every frequency. Every band. I want every ship in that fleet to receive what I'm about to say. He looked at Lena. Translate in real time. She nodded. He stood straight, looking out at the Nexus and the fleet that surrounded it, and he began to speak. My name is James Rowe. I am a human being from the planet Earth. I have spent 50 years of my life in service of the people of my world, and I have spent the last 13 years traveling to be here, in front of you, to say something that I believe you need to hear. You sent us a message. You told us we were primitive. You told us we were dangerous. You told us to kneel. You gave us instructions and a deadline and the implicit promise that if we did not comply, you would correct us. You expected us to be afraid. You expected us to comply or to fail to comply and wait to be destroyed. You did not expect this. He paused, letting the words reach them, letting the translation systems do their work. I understand why you didn't expect it. From what I've come to understand about your history, and we have been studying you as carefully as you have been studying us, every species you have ever encountered either joined you willingly or was defeated. You have a very long track record of being the most powerful thing in the room. I do not doubt that track record. I do not doubt your capability or your reach or the genuine scale of what your civilization has built over thousands of years. But I need to tell you something about humans because I think you misunderstood us. You looked at us and you saw warfare and chaos and a young violent species that needed to be contained before it became a problem. And you were not entirely wrong to see those things. We have warfare in our history. We have done terrible things to each other. We have been cruel and short-sighted and destructive in ways that, seen from the outside, must look alarming. But you saw what we do when we're at our worst. You didn't see what we do when we're at our best. When we're at our best, we build things. Not just ships and weapons, though as you can see we are fairly good at those too. We build ideas. We build systems of thought that change how we see reality. We build music and stories and mathematics that reach for things we can barely describe. We look at the universe and instead of fearing it, we fall in love with it. We name your stars. We look up at them from the ground and we dream about what's there. Every civilization on Earth has looked up at the sky and reached toward it, in one way or another, for as long as we've been capable of looking up. And when you told us to kneel, when you looked at all of that and decided it was something to be corrected, 287 ships full of the most determined, stubborn, creative, and alive people I have ever had the privilege of knowing traveled 13 years through the dark to tell you, face to face, in a language you cannot misunderstand. No. Not because we want war with you. Not because we think we are better than you. Not because we have some claim to supremacy in this galaxy. We came here to say no because saying no is what we do. It is what we have always done when something tries to take from us the thing that matters most. Not our lives, not our planet, not our resources. The thing that matters most to us is harder to describe than any of those. It is the freedom to be what we are. To make mistakes and learn from them. To be young and foolish and growing. To reach toward things we can barely see. You looked at a young civilization and decided it was a threat. I am asking the members of this council who have argued for 20 years that we deserved a different approach, to consider a different possibility. Consider what it would mean to have us as neighbors instead of subjects. Consider what a species that traveled 13 years in the dark to have a conversation might be capable of building in 1,000 years of peace. Consider, because I believe there are people listening who already know this, that the galaxy is larger than your models of it. And that the universe has room for more kinds of life than your history has shown you. We are here. We are not kneeling. We would very much prefer to talk. HFY, and from this point on, whatever comes next, it is your choice as much as ours. The floor is yours. There was silence on every channel. It lasted 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Rose stood at the front of the bridge, not moving, not sitting, watching the Authority fleet and waiting. Behind him, on the bridge, no one spoke. No one moved. Then David Okafor quietly said, "Sir, one of their ships is moving." Rose looked at the sensor display. "Which one?" "The small one," said Okafor. "The one at the outer edge. The one the dissident messages came from." The small ship was moving out of the Authority formation. Moving away from the fleet, slowly, deliberately, and positioning itself, not between the fleet and the Armada, but beside the Armada. Adjacent. Parallel. Sarachin said very softly, she's standing with us. More silence. Then, from the main broadcast channel, not the dissident frequency but the full, open, authority-wide broadcast, another voice came. A different voice. Not Vishari, this voice was harsher, more formal. It spoke in the authority language and Lena Bright translated in real time, her voice barely above a whisper. The council is in emergency session. You will maintain your position and await the outcome. This. And then the broadcast cut off. What happened? Said Roe. The transmission was interrupted, said Marcus Webb, who was monitoring communications from a secondary station on the bridge. He looked up. Sir, there are multiple ships in the authority fleet changing positions. Not toward us. There. He stared at his screen. They're arguing with each other. What happened inside the Galactic Authority's nexus in the hours following Roe's speech was something that Lena Bright had spent 13 years modeling and still had not fully predicted. Because even the best models of behavior, she would later say, cannot account for the moment when a speech lands somewhere it wasn't aimed. The dissident faction, Vishari's faction, had been arguing for 20 years that humanity was different. That the approach being taken was wrong. That a civilization capable of what humans had built should be treated as a potential partner, not a problem to be corrected. They had been losing that argument consistently year after year, because the dominant faction had data and precedent on their side. Every dangerous civilization they had ever encountered had eventually been corrected, and the authority had continued to function. Why should this be different? But Roe's speech had done something that 20 years of internal argument had not done. It had made the question felt, not just understood. Because the speech had gone out on all channels. Not just to the council. To every ship in the authority fleet. To every member of every crew. To thousands of individuals from dozens of species, spread across those 700 vessels, who had been told their whole lives that they were part of the most advanced, most comprehensive civilization the galaxy had produced. And they had just heard a human being 13 years from home, standing in front of 700 ships with 287, tell them that he had not come to fight. That he had come to be seen. That he was asking, not demanding, for the chance to be neighbors. A lot of those individuals had never heard anything like that before. Not from a species being corrected. Not from the outside. The outside, in their experience, was either controlled or threatening. Not this. Not alive in the way Vishari had been trying to describe for 20 years. The emergency council session inside the Nexus was loud, even by the standards of a species that communicated in light patterns. There were arguments that got physical in the way that Veth arguments got physical, which involved color changes that registered as alarming on every biometric sensor in the chamber. There were representatives from 9 different species in the council, and they were not unified. They had never been unified on the Earth question, and after Roe's speech, the divisions cracked open in ways that the dominant faction had not anticipated. 3 of the 9 species representatives formally requested a cessation of the correction process pending further review. 2 others held firm on immediate action. The remaining 4 were, in the brutal mathematics of decision-making, swaying. And outside, in the dark, 287 black ships held their position and waited. Roe did not sleep during the 8 hours after his speech. He sat on the bridge, drank coffee, and watched the sensor displays as the Authority fleet continued its internal reconfigurations. Ships that had been powering weapons had powered them down. Ships that had been in tight combat formation had drifted into looser groupings. 2 more ships had peeled away from the main fleet, not toward the Armada, not away from the Nexus, but into a third position that the navigation team interpreted as neutral. More of them, said Amara Diallo, tracking the movements. That's 11 ships now holding separate positions. Vishari's people, said Roe. There are more than 11 ships worth of people in her faction, said Lena, who had been monitoring the dissident channel continuously. But it takes a lot for someone to move their ship. That's a public statement. The others, they may be sympathetic but not ready to act. How do we reach the ones who aren't ready? Said Roe. Lena thought for a long time. Then she said, show them something they haven't seen. What? Show them who came with you, she said. You gave them a speech. One human being. They listened because you were strong and direct and unafraid. Now show them the rest. Show them, she paused, searching for words. Show them the children. Roe looked at her. The children. 43 children were born on this fleet. Born in the dark between stars. Born in the 13 years of this journey. They've never seen Earth. They've never stood on a planet. They grew up here on these ships between you and whatever was out here. Lena's voice was quiet and certain. No species in the Galactic Authority's history has ever done that. No species has ever come to a confrontation with their children in tow, because no species would do that. It's too dangerous. It's not rational. She looked at him. But it's human. It is completely, inescapably human. And I think if the people on those ships see that, if they see 43 children who grew up here, they will understand something about us that a speech can't fully explain. Ro was quiet for a long moment. He thought about what it meant to ask those children, those kids who had grown up on the Defiance and the Iron Resolve and the other ships, who knew no other home than this fleet, who thought the hum of an engine was the sound of the world, to be part of this. He thought about what they would say if he asked them. He already knew. He had watched them grow up. He knew exactly what they would say. Ask them, he said to Lena. Ask the children if they want to say something. What the children said, what 31 of the 43 children in the fleet chose to record and send out on all available channels, became, in the years that followed, some of the most talked about messages in the history of human authority relations. They were not coordinated. They were not rehearsed. Each child recorded their own message in their own words in their own language, and the fleet's translation systems rendered all of them in authority communication patterns in real time. A 7-year-old girl named Lucia, born on the Iron Resolve, said simply, "I was born in space. I've never been to Earth, but my mom and dad tell me about it all the time. It sounds really nice. I hope I get to go there someday. I hope there's not a war. Wars are sad." A 12-year-old boy named Kofi Jr., born on a ship called the Sunrise and named after his father's habit with words, said, "My dad says that going to space is the bravest thing people can do. I grew up in space and I think the bravest thing people can do is talk to someone who's different from you and really listen. Can you listen to us? We're not scary. I promise." A 14-year-old girl named Mia, born on the Defiance itself, making her technically a child of the flagship, said with the particular directness of someone who had been raised around military officers, "I know why you're afraid of us. I've read the history. Humans do some pretty scary things sometimes. But I also know that the people on these ships came 13 years to be here. And not one of them wanted to come here to hurt anyone. They came because someone told their families to kneel and they decided that wasn't acceptable. I don't think that makes us dangerous. I think it makes us human. I think maybe that's worth learning about instead of correcting." That last one, Mia's message, was the one that Vishari later said had finally turned the vote. The Galactic Authority Council voted 7 hours after the children's messages were broadcast. It was not unanimous. The dominant faction did not become the minority overnight. Ideologies built over centuries do not collapse in an afternoon, even when confronted with a 14-year-old girl who speaks with absolute moral clarity. 2 of the 9 species representatives continued to vote for immediate corrective action. But the 4 who had been swaying broke in favor of suspension of the correction process, pending formal diplomatic engagement. The result was 5-2 in favor of suspension, with 2 abstentions from representatives who were so deeply conflicted that they simply could not cast a vote either way. Rowe received the formal communication from the council, cold, procedural, deeply reluctant in tone, but unambiguous in content, 14 hours after his speech. The correction process for the planetary system designated Sol 3 is hereby suspended pending formal diplomatic review. The vessels designated as the Black Armada are requested to maintain their current position and await further instruction. A formal communication channel will be established within 48 of your planetary hours. He read it twice. Then he opened the fleet-wide channel. He did not make a speech this time. He just said very simply, "Stand down from combat readiness. We've been heard." The sound that went through 287 ships, when those words arrived, was something that no recording ever fully captured. It was not a cheer exactly, it was too complicated for a cheer. It was the sound of people who had held themselves in controlled readiness for so long that release felt almost physical, like a pressure valve finally opening. Rowe sat back in his command chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Then Sarah Chin said, "Sir." Her tone made him open his eyes immediately. He knew that tone. "What?" "3 ships," she said. "Authority fleet. Separating from the main body. Moving toward us. Fast." He was on his feet. "Weapon status?" "Powered," said Okafor. "Not ours, theirs. They're coming in hot." "Signal from Vishari," said Lena sharply. "She says, it's the hardliners. They lost the vote and they're acting independently. The council cannot stop them quickly enough. You need to survive the next 10 minutes. 3 ships. Large ships. Each one significantly larger than anything in the Black Armada. "Battle stations," said Rowe. "All ships in proximity sectors prepare to receive fire. Do not, fire unless fired upon. Sir, they outgun us individually. I know. Don't fire until I say. The 3 authority ships came in at speed, and at exactly the range that Ro had been watching for, they fired. The beams they fired were something the Black Armada had never seen in testing. They were something Yara Solan's team had theorized but not confirmed. They came in as a concentrated column of energized particles, moving at a speed that the sensor systems tracked with difficulty, and they hit 3 of the Armada's outer ships with a force that immediately became clear on the damage displays. 3 ships in the Armada's outer formation took hits. The shields held, barely. The engineering teams reported structural stress but no critical breaches. They're recharging for a second shot, said Okafor. His voice was absolutely steady. How long? Said Ro. 40 seconds. Ro looked at the tactical display. He had been thinking about this possibility, not the certainty of it but the possibility, for the last 8 hours. He had a plan. Not a plan he was happy about, but a plan. Target the hardliner ships, he said. Non-lethal options only. David, you know what I mean. Okafor did know what he meant. He had spent 3 years on the way out here, developing a subset of the Black Armada's weapon systems that operated on a principle Yara Solan had identified in the alien signal analysis. The same physics branch difference that had first suggested humanity had capabilities the Authority wouldn't predict. The weapons he had developed in that mode were not designed to destroy. They were designed to disrupt. Specifically to interfere with the energy systems that powered the Authority ship's weapons and drives, temporarily, without causing hull damage or casualties. He had called them, in the crew's informal terminology, the quiet option. Use them now. The effect was immediate and visible on the sensors. The 3 hardliner ships lit up with a cascade of system disruptions that their weapons couldn't recharge through. The energy feedback from the disruption field overloaded the recharge cycle and knocked the weapons offline. The ship's drives sputtered. They drifted. They were not destroyed. They were not boarded. They were simply stopped. Silence on all channels for a moment. Then, from the main nexus, from the official council channel, the council formally acknowledges the restraint shown by the Black Armada commander in response to unauthorized hostile action by rogue fleet elements. The council has taken those vessels into custody. This incident does not represent the council's position. Ro exhaled slowly. Status of our 3 ships, he said. Damaged, said Chin. Shield systems took significant strain. No casualties. She paused. No casualties, Commander. He looked at her. Good, he said. That's the only number that matters. In the aftermath of the hardliner attack and its non-lethal resolution, something shifted in the dynamics between the Armada and the Authority fleet. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in ways that Lena Bright tracked carefully and reported to Ro in daily briefings. Ships in the Authority fleet that had been maintaining strict combat posture began to ease off. Communication channels that had been closed began to open. Individual crew members on Authority ships, from species that had never communicated directly with a human being, began sending low-level signals, apparently personal in nature, on non-official frequencies. They're curious, said Lena with a smile she couldn't hide. They have a whole fleet full of beings who just watched a species from 13 light-years away stand down a fight it could have made much worse, and they want to know what we are. What do we tell them? Said Ro. We tell them the truth, she said. We tell them we're humans. She came aboard the Defiance on day 17 after the vote, the first member of the Galactic Authority to physically cross the distance between the 2 fleets and stand face-to-face with a human being. She had requested a private meeting with the commander. Ro had agreed, obviously, though he had spent considerable time with Dr. Lena Bright beforehand discussing everything they knew about the Veth, their communication preferences, and what Vishari specifically might want or need from this meeting. She arrived in a small craft, by the Veth's standards modest, that docked at the Defiance's primary airlock. The Veth required different atmospheric conditions than humans, and a section of the ship's secondary conference room had been prepared with appropriate modifications. Ro met her at the airlock. She was tall, about 2.5 meters, a body plan that was bilaterally symmetrical but substantially different from human, with 4 arms and a torso that rippled with slow light pattern communications that Lena translated in real time via an earpiece. Her face, if it was the right word, was large-eyed and mobile, capable of a range of expression that, once you calibrated to it, was actually surprisingly readable. She stopped in front of Ro. She looked at him for a long moment with those large liquid eyes. He looked back at her. Then she said, and Lena translated, "You are smaller than I expected." Ro blinked. Then he laughed, a genuine, surprised, completely human laugh. I get that a lot, he said. Something moved across Vishari's face that Lena identified as the Veth equivalent of humor. I have been arguing for 20 years, she said, that your species was not what my colleagues believed. I'm glad to see I was right. Though I will say that the way you were right was not entirely what I predicted. What did you predict? Said Ro, walking with her toward the conference room. I predicted that your species, if given the opportunity, would make the argument for your own value. I did not predict that you would travel 13 years in the dark with your children to do it. We couldn't leave them behind, said Ro simply. Some of them were born after we left. And the ones who were old enough. He paused. There's a particular kind of stubbornness that develops in children who grow up surrounded by people who have made an impossible choice and kept going. They don't know how to be anything other than determined. It would have been cruel to take that away from them by making them wait. Vishari was quiet for a moment. The messages they sent, she said. The child who said humans are worth learning about instead of correcting. She paused. That one reached people that I could not reach in 20 years. Because she was not making an argument. She was simply being what she was. She is her mother's daughter, said Ro. Her mother is one of my engineers. They're both like that. They reached the conference room. They sat, Vishari on furniture that had been modified to accommodate her, Ro in his usual chair. Lena was present at a secondary position translating. What do you need from this meeting? Ro asked. Vishari looked at him directly. I need to know what you want, she said. Not what you said in your speech. Not the political position. What you actually want for your species going forward. Ro thought about it for a moment. Really thought about it. Not the strategic answer. The true answer. We want to be left alone to grow, he said. We want to make our mistakes and learn from them and keep building. We're young. We know we're young. We've been children for most of our history and we're starting, maybe, to grow up. He paused. We don't want to be subjects. We don't want to be corrected. We want to be, I know this sounds strange, we want to be allowed to be what we are. Vishari was very still. You said in your speech, consider what a species that traveled 13 years in the dark to have a conversation might be capable of building in 1,000 years of peace, she said. I meant it. I know, she said. So did the council. She paused. What I am going to tell you now is not the official position of the Galactic Authority. It is my assessment as someone who has studied your species for 20 years, of what is actually possible. She paused again. The vote to suspend the correction process was 5-2. That is a majority, but it is not a consensus. The two who voted for correction are not going to stop believing what they believe. The faction that produced the hardliner attack will rebuild itself, possibly under different leadership, and it will try again. I know, said Ro. The suspension is not a solution. It is a pause. She looked at him. What would make it more than a pause is what happens next. If your species and mine, and the others who voted to suspend, can build something together. Something that demonstrates, practically and visibly, that the relationship between Earth and the Authority can be something other than subject and administrator. She paused. I have been thinking about this for a long time. I believe it is possible. But it requires your species to be patient and consistent and present, in a way that goes beyond sending a fleet. Ro looked at her for a long moment. You're not just asking me to negotiate a ceasefire, he said. You're asking us to stay. I am asking you to send people, she said. Diplomats. Scientists. People who will be here, in this system in contact with us, long term. Not soldiers. Not a fleet. People. She paused. The beings on those ships who sent me messages asking what you are, they want to know. The way I wanted to know 20 years ago. That curiosity is what we build on. HFY, said Ro quietly. She tilted her head, the Veth gesture for curiosity. What does that mean? It means, and from this point on, he said. It means things are different now. She looked at him with those large ancient eyes, and the light patterns across her body shifted into something that Lena translated, quietly, as hope. Yes, said Vishari. Things are different now. The formal treaty between Earth and the Galactic Authority was not signed for another 2 years. It was not a perfect document. It was not everything either side wanted. It was, like all real agreements between complex parties with long histories and genuine differences, a compromise, full of careful language and built-in review processes and clauses that both sides knew they would argue about for decades. But it was a treaty and not a correction order, and that made it something that had never existed before in the history of the Galactic Authority, an agreement reached through conversation rather than command. Vishari represented the Authority's diplomatic team. Ambassador Patricia Cole, who had been waiting 13 years for this moment, traveled to the Nexus system via a fast diplomatic vessel and represented Earth. She and Vishari, who had been in communication since the fleet's arrival, worked together with a team of lawyers and linguists and specialists from 6 different species over 19 months to produce something that both sides could accept. Ro was present for the signing, which took place aboard the Defiance. He stood at the back of the room, next to Elena Vasquez, who had come out on the diplomatic vessel, because she had built the ship and she was not going to miss what happened on it, and watched Patricia Cole and Vishari each place their mark on the document. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The Black Armada began its journey home 3 months after the treaty signing. Not all of it. A small flotilla of 20 ships stayed as part of the agreement as a permanent presence in the Alpha Centauri system. Not a military presence. A diplomatic and scientific one. An exchange was established. Humans would maintain a station near the Nexus. The Authority would maintain a station in Earth's orbit. 2 of the 43 children born in the fleet chose to stay. One of them was Mia, the 14-year-old, now 16, who had sent the message that had turned the vote. She stayed with her mother, who volunteered for the diplomatic posting, and began what would become a 50-year career as one of the most important figures in human authority relations. The other was Kofi Jr., who wanted to study Veth astrophysics. His father, the engineer who had used the word Caro in a way that had stayed with Ro for 13 years, wept when he found out. And then he laughed because his son was clearly, completely his father's son, and there was nothing to do but be proud. The journey home took 13 years, of course. 267 ships. Older now, worn by years of interstellar travel, patched in places and modified and carrying the marks of a journey that had changed everyone who made it. The ships that had left Earth's orbit as humanity's desperate gamble returned as something that had a name now, the Armada of First Contact, the history books would call it. The fleet that went to the edge of the known universe and started a conversation. The children born on the fleet were young adults now. Most of them had never seen Earth. Most of them were, at various levels of awareness, nervous about arriving at a planet with gravity and open sky and wind, for the first time. A boy named Daniel, born on a mid-fleet ship called the Patient Star, came to Ro 3 months before their arrival in the solar system. He was 17 years old and looked like every 17-year-old Ro had ever met, energetic and uncertain and trying very hard to look like he wasn't either. "Commander," he said. "What's it like?" What's it actually like? Ro thought about it for a long moment. His memory of Earth, of Oregon, of the coast, of the smell of salt water and the sound of waves, of the weight of gravity and the texture of actual wood in his hands, was 13 years in the future and 13 years in the past simultaneously. It lived in him like something preserved. "It's big," he said finally. "Not big like space is big. Space is big in a way you can measure and calculate. Earth is big in a way you feel. You stand outside under an open sky with a horizon and the world just goes. In every direction. As far as you can see." He paused. "And there's this thing called wind. It's the air moving. You can't see it but you feel it on your face and it smells like whatever it's come from, the ocean, a forest, rain." He paused again. "The first breath of outside air you take when we land, you'll know what I mean. You'll feel it in a way I can't explain right now." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared to go back?" Ro blinked. He hadn't expected that question, which meant the boy was perceptive. "A little," he admitted. "Not scared of it. Scared of how much it's changed. Scared of how much I've changed." He paused. "But mostly I just want to hear the ocean again." Daniel nodded, processing this. "Commander, do you think it was worth it? All of it?" Ro looked at him. This boy who had been born between stars, who had grown up in the dark, who had been part of something extraordinary without choosing to be part of it, who was about to set foot on a planet for the first time and feel wind on his face and stand under an open sky with a horizon that went forever. "You're here," said Ro simply. "You exist. You were born in the space between stars and you're going to walk on the world where your parents came from, and you're going to go back out into that space eventually and do things that neither of us can imagine yet." He looked at the boy steadily. "Yes. It was worth it." The Black Armada entered the solar system on a clear day in April. They came in from the direction of Alpha Centauri, 26 years after the first alien message had arrived on every screen on Earth. The people who had been children when the message came were adults now. The people who had been adults had aged. The world had changed, not as much as people had feared in those first terrified days, but not as little as people sometimes hoped when they wanted normalcy back. The Earth that waited for them was a world that had been living for 26 years, with the knowledge that it was not alone, that it never had been alone, and that the universe was far more complex and populated than any dream or nightmare had quite captured. The cities had kept going. People had kept building and arguing and falling in love and making music and all the ordinary, extraordinary things that humans did. There had been changes, technological, political, psychological, shaped by the reality of alien contact and the long wait to find out what had happened to the fleet they had sent. But the world was still there. The people were still there. When the fleet appeared on Earth's sensors, it was a Tuesday. Again. The universe apparently had a sense of humor. Commander James Rowe stood at the forward viewport of the Defiance as the solar system opened around them, the sun warm and familiar, Jupiter massive and beautiful, the inner planets coming into alignment, and their third from the sun, blue and green and white, exactly as he remembered it and completely impossible to have prepared for. He pressed his hand flat against the viewport glass, the way a person presses their hand against a window to feel the cold on the other side, to confirm that something real is there. He was 63 years old. He had been gone for 26 years. He was coming home. Behind him the bridge was quiet. Not the tense, watchful quiet of a combat situation or an uncertain diplomatic moment. A different kind of quiet, the kind that falls over a group of people who are all feeling something too large and too important for words. Sarah Chin came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "We made it." "Yes," said Rowe. She looked at him. Her first officer for 26 years, her colleague and her adversary in 100 arguments and her partner in something that had turned out to be, in the end, one of the most important things any human beings had ever done. "What was the plan exactly?" she said. "When you stood up in front of 700 alien warships and started talking, what was the plan?" "I told you at the time," he said. "Show them what we are. But you didn't know it would work." He looked at her. "No. I didn't know it would work." He paused. "But I knew we were humans. And I knew that humans have been showing up to impossible situations since before we had words for impossible. We've been standing up in the face of things we couldn't defeat and saying anyway and figuring it out as we went, for 200,000 years. He looked back at Earth, blue and impossible and right there. I wasn't betting on the plan. I was betting on us. The landing, the actual physical arrival of the Armada's crew on Earth's surface, happened over several days. 267 ships, each with its crew, each needing to come down through the atmosphere on shuttles, each set of returning humans being met by whatever remained of their families and their lives. Rowe came down on the third day. He had chosen to go after most of his crew, a deliberate choice because he wanted to watch them land first, wanted to see the children of the fleet step on the Earth of Earth for the first time, wanted to see the look on their faces when the sky opened up above them and went all the way to the horizon. He was not disappointed. Daniel, the boy he had talked to about the wind, stepped off the shuttle ramp at the landing site in Oregon, which Rowe had chosen specifically because it was the place he knew, the coast he had left from 26 years ago. The boy walked 2 steps forward and stopped. Rowe watched his face. The wind came in from the ocean, carrying salt and rain and pine and everything that the Pacific coast of Oregon had been smelling like for millions of years before humanity arrived and would smell like for millions of years after. It hit Daniel in the face and his eyes went wide and his mouth opened slightly and he stood there for a full 30 seconds. Completely still, the way a person stands when something real arrives that they had only ever known as a description. Then he turned and looked at Rowe with an expression that had no name in any language. Rowe nodded. Daniel turned back to the ocean. He walked toward it, across the grass, down to the sand, and stood at the edge of the water with the waves coming in around his feet, looking out at the horizon. Rowe watched him and felt something that he would not have been able to describe to anyone who had never been 26 years from home and then finally arrived. It was not joy exactly. It was not relief exactly. It was larger than both of those things and quieter than either. He walked down to the water's edge and stood beside Daniel. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally Daniel said, looking out at the ocean, "You were right." "About what?" "About it being big in a way you feel." Rowe looked at the horizon, where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky with no line between them, just gradations of color going on forever. "Yeah," he said. The world that received the Armada's crew was not the world they had left. But it was the world they had come home to, and the difference was important. The treaty with the Galactic Authority had begun a process that was not simple or quick. Nothing between civilizations with such different histories and frameworks ever was, but was real. The Authority station in Earth's orbit was operational. Human scientists were studying with Veth colleagues. The 2 species representatives were arguing about trade agreements and communication protocols and cultural exchange in the particular way that people who are engaged enough to argue are actually doing something productive. The hardliner faction within the Authority had not disappeared. Vishari had warned that it wouldn't. But it had been weakened by the vote and further weakened by the failure of the attack on the Armada, an attack that had been met with a non-lethal response, which had turned out to be one of the most powerful diplomatic statements in the history of two civilizations learning to be neighbors. You do not forget, as a species, the day when your opponents had every reason to destroy you and chose not to. The two Authority ships from the hardliner faction, the ones that had been stopped by the quiet option, had been returned to the main fleet after the treaty signing. Their crews had been released. Ro had made the decision to not ask for anything in return for their release. Just, here are your people back. That's who we are. Vishari had communicated later that this decision, more than anything else, had definitively broken the hardliners' political momentum within the council. You cannot build a fear campaign around a species that keeps returning your prisoners. In the years after the return, James Rowe did what he had been trying to do when the whole thing started. He retired. He went back to the coast of Oregon. He built things with wood. He read books. He walked along the beach in the mornings and listened to the waves. The difference was that now, when he looked up at the stars, he knew what was out there. He had shaken hands with it, or the Veth equivalent of a handshake, which involved a complex pattern of light and a particular arm position that he had learned to approximate in a way that Vishari had described as surprisingly graceful for a biped. He had stood in front of 700 warships and said no. He had watched children born in the darkness between stars take their first steps on a planet and feel the wind on their faces. Elena Vasquez came to visit him once, a year after the return. She was building something new, a research vessel, not a warship, designed for the exchange program for the humans who were going back out to the Nexus and beyond. She wanted his input on the tactical framework, even though it was a science ship and did not technically need a tactical framework. He knew why she really came. Same reason he sometimes looked at the stars longer than strictly necessary. "Do you miss it?" she asked him, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the ocean. He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "Not the fear. Not the waiting. But, yes, the clarity. The simplicity of it. Out there we knew what mattered. We know what matters here too," she said. "Yeah," he said. "But here it's harder to see." She laughed. Dr. Yara Solin, who had stayed on Earth throughout the Armada's journey and had spent 26 years monitoring the Alpha Centauri system and advancing every field of human science that the exchange of information with the Authority had opened up, published a paper in the final year of the return period that was read by every scientist on Earth and several who were not technically on Earth. Its title was, "What the Galactic Authority Didn't Know About Primitive Species." Its central argument was this, that the Authority had built its entire classification system on a model of civilizational development that mapped perfectly well to the development of every species it had previously encountered, a smooth progression from primitive to advanced, with clear indicators at each stage of what a species was capable of. By those indicators, humanity was indeed primitive. Young, violent, technically limited, with a brief recorded history and no capacity for interstellar travel. But the Authority's model had no category for what humanity actually was. A species defined not by what it had, but by what it was willing to do. A species that could be stripped of every advantage and still find a way. A species that had never, in its entire existence, learned to recognize when it was beaten. Not because humans were incapable of recognizing defeat, but because humanity, at its core, had always been more interested in the question of what came next than in the question of whether it had lost. HFY, Yara wrote in the paper's final paragraph, which was unusual for a scientific document. And from this point on, this is the phrase a soldier used in a dark place very far from home, to describe the turning point. I believe it is also the phrase that best describes what humanity has always been, in every dark place it has ever found itself. A species that looks at the worst moment and says, and from this point on, whatever comes next we are going toward it. We were told to kneel. We answered with the Black Armada. But more than the ships, more than the weapons, more than the willingness to fight, what we answered with was who we are. A species that does not recognize the moment when it is supposed to stop. I do not think the Galactic Authority will make the mistake of forgetting that again. Neither will anyone else who was there. Mia, the girl who had sent the message that turned the vote, who had stayed behind at the Nexus to build a life between two civilizations, sent a message back to Earth on the day the Armada returned. She sent it on the general broadcast, open to everyone. It was short. She was 16 years old and she had always known how to say what she meant. I watched you leave 13 years ago and now I'm watching you arrive back home from 13 light years away. You did it. All of you. We did it. I know a lot of people back there are still scared about what comes next with the Authority. I know it's complicated and it's going to stay complicated for a long time. But I want you to know something from someone who lives here, in between the two of us, seeing both sides every day. They respect us now. Not because of the ships. Not because of the weapons. Because of who we are when we're paying attention. Because we came all this way and chose not to destroy something we could have destroyed. Because a man stood up in front of 700 warships and gave a speech about the wind. Because 43 kids were born in the dark and grew up to say something that changed a vote. We're not primitive. We never were. We were just young. We're growing up now. And I think the universe is going to be very interested in what we become. Caro. Asterisk. Epilogue. The long view. 1,000 years later, not in this story but in the history that grew out of it, scholars of interstellar civilization would look back at the events of the Black Armada and identify the precise moment when the arc of human history changed direction. It was not the construction of the fleet, though that was extraordinary. It was not the 13-year journey, though that was extraordinary too. It was not even the speech, though that speech would be printed on the walls of every school and diplomatic station that humanity built in the centuries that followed. It was a moment nobody planned. A moment that happened in the middle of a battle that almost happened, in the narrow space between violence and its alternative. It was the moment when Commander James Rowe, facing 700 warships with 287, said hold and held and chose the harder thing. Because the easier thing, the thing any reasonable military commander could have justified facing attack, would have been to fight. To hit back hard. To demonstrate once and finally that humanity was not something to trifle with. And he could have done it. The quiet option was not the only option. The Black Armada had other weapons. Real ones. The kind that destroyed things. He chose not to use them. Not because he was weak. Not because he was afraid. But because he understood, in the precise, clear way that people understand things when all the noise of fear and strategy is stripped away, that the choice he made in that moment was not a military choice. It was a statement about what humanity was. You are what you do at the worst moment. You are what you choose when the choice costs something. He chose to hold. And the universe, which had been watching for a very long time, much longer than humanity knew, through sensors and observers and the quiet eyes of species that kept their distance and waited to see what this strange, young, impossible civilization would do, took note. Caro. HFY. From this point on. Indy.